I have no one to help me into the water when it's stirred up. And when I do get close, the others step down in front of me.
Buckle up, because we're about to peel back the layers on one of history's greatest missing chapters. Forget the Sunday school felt boards for a second. We're diving into the provocative theory that the radical rabbi from Nazareth spent his lost years trading the Galilee for the Ganges. Was Christ actually a high-level initiate of Eastern mysticism? From ancient scrolls in Ladakh to the linguistic echoes of Isha, we're exploring if the cross was actually preceded by the Lotus. So, was Jesus a Hindu yogi? The great 18-year gap. If you crack open the New Testament, you'll notice a massive, gaping hole in the resume of history's most influential figure. We see Jesus at 12, impressing the scholars in the temple with his precocious wit, and then, poof, he vanishes into thin air. He doesn't reappear until he's 30, walking out of the desert to get baptized by John. In the world of storytelling, that's not just a minor plot hole, that's an entire missing trilogy of development. Traditionally, the Sunday school version tells us he was simply back in Nazareth, perhaps making chairs or fixing door frames, living the quiet life of a humble carpenter. But if we are being honest, does that really track with the profile of a radical? Think about it. The ancient world was a hive of intellectual and spiritual movement. If you were a young man possessed by a divine spark and a restless, radical mind, would you really spend 18 long years sanding down cedar planks in a tiny, dusty village while the world's greatest philosophies were swirling just a few caravan routes away? The carpenter theory feels like a convenient, safe placeholder for a total lack of historical data. There is absolutely no record of his life during this specific time frame in the canonical Gospels. This silence is the vacuum that the Hindu Yogi narrative rushes to fill, suggesting that Jesus wasn't just waiting around for his 30s to start, he was actively training in the East. The theory posits that Jesus followed the Silk Road, a path well trodden by merchants, mystics, and seekers of the era. The leap from Judea to India isn't as far-fetched as it sounds when you consider the Greco-Buddhist influence already creeping into the West through trade. In this light, the missing years weren't spent in mundane labor, but in a rigorous, cross-continental apprenticeship. We are talking about a spiritual genius seeking the source code of human consciousness. If he were indeed studying with Brahmins or Buddhist monks, it would explain why, when he finally returned to his homeland, his message sounded so fundamentally different from the rigid legalism of the Pharisees. He wasn't just quoting the Torah, he was speaking about the kingdom of heaven as an internal state, a concept much closer to the Hindu Atman than the traditional Jewish messianic expectation of a political liberator. Those 18 years provide the necessary runway for a local rabbi to transform into a universal mystic. Whether he was a carpenter or a world traveler, the result was a man who spoke with an authority suggesting he had seen far more than just the rolling hills of Galilee. But how does a carpenter from a backwater town actually navigate a 4,000-mile trek across the world's most dangerous terrain? The Silk Road connection. To the modern mind, the idea of a young man from Nazareth trekking to India sounds like a Bronze Age version of Mission Impossible. We tend to imagine the ancient world as a collection of isolated pockets, where everyone lived and died within a 10-mile radius of their birth. But that's a massive historical oversight. By the time Jesus would have been packing his bags, the Silk Road wasn't just a dirt path, it was the world's most sophisticated information superhighway. It was a sprawling, pulsating network of trade routes that linked the Mediterranean to the heart of Asia, carrying not just spices and silk, but radical ideas, philosophies, and spiritual seekers looking for the source. If Jesus wanted to reach the East, he wouldn't have been wandering aimlessly through the desert with a canteen. He would have joined a caravan, a massive, organized mobile city of merchants and protectors. These caravans moved from Judea through the Parthian Empire into what we now call Iran and Afghanistan, and eventually down into the Indus Valley. This wasn't a journey for the faint of heart, but for a young man with nothing but a staff and a burning curiosity, it was entirely feasible. In fact, historical records show that Buddhist missionaries had already reached as far west as Athens and Alexandria centuries before. The door was already wide open. Someone just had to walk through it. The geopolitical landscape of the 1st century actually favored this kind of travel. Despite the various skirmishes between Rome and Parthia, the trade routes remained the lifeblood of the global economy, meaning they were relatively well guarded. A traveler could move from caravanserai to caravanserai, essentially ancient motels, sharing meals and stories with people from every corner of the known world. It was in these communal hubs that a young Jesus would have first encountered the concepts of reincarnation, dharma, and the yogic mastery of the breath. He wouldn't have been an alien in a strange land. He would have been one of many seekers of the way, traveling toward the rising sun. Think of the Silk Road as the 1st century internet. It was where the mystical traditions of the East began to bleed into the monotheism of the West. If Jesus spent his silent years on this road, he wasn't just a passenger. He was a student of the world. He would have arrived in India not as a tourist, but as an initiate, ready to swap his carpenter's tools for the deeper mysteries of the soul. So, if the road was open, who actually saw him at the other end of the map? Notovich and the Ladakh Scroll. Enter Nicholas Notovich, a Russian war correspondent with a penchant for high-altitude drama and a knack for stumbling into historical controversies. In 1887, while trekking through the rugged wind-swept mountains of Ladakh in the Himalayas, Notovich ended up at the Hemis Monastery, a secluded fortress of spirituality perched precariously on a cliffside. As the story goes, a conveniently timed broken leg, the kind of literary trope that makes skeptics squint, forced him to remain at the monastery for several weeks of recovery. It was during this period of enforced stillness that Notovich struck up an unlikely friendship with the head lama. Amidst the smell of butter tea and incense, the lama allegedly brought out 2 large yellowed volumes of silk-bound manuscripts that had been tucked away for centuries. These weren't just standard Buddhist sutras, they were the life of Saint Isha, a record of a traveler from the West who bore a striking resemblance to the Nazarene. According to Notovich's later translation, Isha was the name given to a divine child born in Israel who arrived in India at the tender age of 14. The scrolls supposedly detailed his extensive travels through the Sindh region, his deep study of the Vedas under the tutelage of Brahmin priests, and his eventual explosive fallout with the religious elite. Why the conflict? Because Isha apparently insisted on teaching the Holy Scriptures to the lower castes and the untouchables, a move that sat about as well with the ancient Indian establishment as Jesus's later antics would with the Pharisees. This Isha was a spiritual rebel, a proto-socialist who rejected the rigid caste system and preached a radical internal theology, that the divine lived within every human soul, regardless of their social status or birthright. This narrative perfectly mirrors the egalitarianism that Jesus would later bring to the shores of the Sea of Galilee, suggesting his "blessed are the poor" rhetoric had a distinct Himalayan flavor. When Notovich returned to Europe and published his findings in 1894 under the title The Unknown Life of Jesus Christ, the theological world absolutely lost its collective mind. Critics immediately labeled it a blatant hoax, a pious fraud, meticulously designed to sell books to a Victorian public already obsessed with Orientalism and the occult. They pointed out that no other Western scholars could seem to locate the scrolls, and the monks at Hemis later allegedly denied ever meeting the Russian journalist. However, the plot thickened significantly in 1922. Swami Abhedananda, a skeptical disciple of the famous Indian mystic Ramakrishna, traveled to Hemis specifically to debunk Notovich's story once and for all. To his utter shock, he claimed the monks not only confirmed the Russian's tale, but actually showed him the same manuscripts, providing a translation that mirrored Notovich's. Years later, the renowned Russian artist and mystic Nicholas Roerich also reported hearing similar folk legends of Isha during his own massive Central Asian expeditions in the 1920s. He noted that the story of a great Isha who came from the West to study the ancient wisdom was woven into the oral traditions of the region, far beyond the walls of a single monastery. The Notovich scandal remains the ultimate smoking gun of this entire theory. Is it a clever 19th century forgery? Or is it a suppressed record of a history that the institutional church simply couldn't afford to let out into the wild? If these scrolls are real, they represent a literal bridge between two worlds that we have been conditioned to believe were light years apart. They suggest that the Son of God wasn't just born with a full download of divine knowledge, but actually went out into the world and earned it, studying the ancient science of the soul in the very place where it had been perfected for millennia. Whether you view Notovich as a visionary pioneer or a master con man, he successfully planted a seed of doubt that has refused to stop growing for over a century. But even if the scrolls remain a mountain mystery, could the very name Jesus hold a hidden Sanskrit secret? Linguistic gymnastics. When we talk about Jesus, we are already using a translation of a translation. To get to the truth of his identity, we have to strip away the Latin Isus and the Greek Iesous to reach his actual Aramaic name, Yeshua. But proponents of the Hindu Yogi theory argue that if you look further east, the linguistic breadcrumbs become even more tantalizing. In the Pali and Sanskrit traditions of India, the name Isha, or Ishvara, is a title for the Supreme Lord, or the Divine Self. Is it merely a massive historical coincidence that the Arabic and Persian name for Jesus is Isa? To a linguist, these similarities might be dismissed as phonological drift, but to a theorist looking for a connection, they represent a hidden signature left across two continents. It suggests that when the Saint Isa of the Ladakh scrolls was being discussed, the locals weren't just mispronouncing a foreign name, they were using a title that already commanded immense spiritual respect in their own tongue. The linguistic gymnastics don't stop at the name itself. They extend to the very concepts Jesus used to describe his mission. Take the word Abba, the intimate Aramaic term Jesus used for God, often translated as Father. In the context of ancient Indian spirituality, this mirrors the relationship between a Kila, student, and a guru, teacher, or the realization of Brahman as the ultimate progenitor of all consciousness. Furthermore, the Messiah, or Christ, the Anointed One, finds a fascinating parallel in the concept of the Krishna consciousness, or the Bodhisattva. Some researchers suggest that the title Christ might not just be a Greek translation of the Hebrew Mashiach, but a Western echo of Krishna itself, the anointed avatar of Vishnu. While mainstream etymology keeps these roots firmly planted in their respective soil, the phonetic overlap is so striking that it's hard not to wonder if the Silk Road acted as a giant telephone game that blurred the lines between the savior of the West and the avatars of the East. Even the phrase King of the Jews takes on a different flavor if you consider a mistranslation of a different kind of king. In the yogic tradition, a Raja Yogi is a king of yogis, one who has achieved complete mastery over the mind and the senses. If Jesus returned from India as a perfected master, he would have been a Raja in the spiritual sense, not a political one. When he stood before Pilate and claimed his kingdom was not of this world, he was speaking the literal language of a Vedantic mystic who viewed the physical realm as Maya, or illusion. This linguistic bridge suggests that the great 18-year gap wasn't just a physical journey, but a complete retooling of his vocabulary. He took the profound, non-dualistic concepts of the Upanishads and translated them into the agrarian metaphors of the Levant. By looking at the roots of these words, we start to see that the gospel might actually be a Sanskrit poem hiding in plain sight, waiting for someone to read between the lines. But if the names match up, does the actual philosophy hold water when we compare the Sermon on the Mount to the Vedas? The Sermon on the Lotus? If you want to find the smoking gun of the Hindu Yogi claim without digging through Himalayan dirt, you don't need a shovel. You just need a Bible. When you place the Sermon on the Mount side by side with the ancient Upanishads or the Bhagavad Gita, the parallels aren't just interesting, they are eerie. Most traditional interpretations of Jesus' most famous discourse focus on it as a refinement of Jewish law. But if you swap the Galilee for the Ganges, the Beatitudes stop sounding like a list of moral shoulds and start sounding like a manual for Advaita Vedanta, the Hindu philosophy of non-dualism. When Jesus says, "The kingdom of God is within you," he isn't just being poetic. He is making a statement that would be instantly recognizable to any yogi as the realization of Atman, the individual soul, being identical to Brahman, the ultimate reality. In the Western tradition, God is usually out there, a bearded judge in the clouds. But the Jesus who returned from his silent years preached a God that was an internal experiential state. "I and my Father are one," he famously declared. To the Pharisees, this was the ultimate blasphemy, a claim to be the Creator himself. But to a student of the Vedas, this is simply the realization of Aham Brahmasmi, I am Brahman. It's the goal of every practitioner of yoga. Jesus wasn't claiming a unique, exclusive divinity that no one else could touch. He was claiming to be a realized soul who had pierced the veil of Maya, or cosmic illusion, and was now inviting everyone else to do the same. He was the guru, pointing the way toward the same internal light he had discovered. Even the specific ethical commands of the sermon feel deeply rooted in the concept of ahimsa, or non-violence. Turn the other cheek and love your enemies are radical departures from the eye for an eye mentality of the Old Testament, but they are the foundational pillars of the yogic path. A yogi views all beings as manifestations of the same divine essence. Therefore, to harm another is to harm oneself. This isn't just being nice, it's a metaphysical recognition of unity. When Jesus speaks about the single eye being full of light, many esoteric researchers point directly to the Ajna chakra, or the third eye of Hindu tradition, the point of intuitive vision that opens only when the ego is transcended through meditation and discipline. Furthermore, his emphasis on detachment from material wealth, do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, mirrors the Hindu stage of sannyasa, the renunciation of worldly ties to pursue the absolute. Jesus lived as a wandering ascetic, owned nothing, and urged his followers to live like the lilies of the field. This is the quintessential life of a sadhu. He wasn't just a social reformer. He was a master of the internal landscape, teaching a crowd of fishermen the sophisticated technology of the soul that had been refined for millennia in the forest academies of India. By the time he finished speaking on that mount, he hadn't just given a sermon. He had delivered a masterclass in Eastern mysticism, disguised as a Middle Eastern parable. But if his words were those of a master, were his miracles actually just the advanced siddhis of a high-level yogi? Miracles or siddhis? When we look at the highlight reel of the Gospels, we see a man who could command the elements, manipulate matter, and defy the laws of biology. To the Western tradition, these are miracles, divine interventions from a localized God used to prove the identity of his Son. But if you shift your perspective to the East, these extraordinary feats have a much more technical name: siddhis. In the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, written centuries before or around the time of Jesus, these perfections are described not as magic, but as the natural byproduct of intense spiritual discipline and the mastery of prana, or life force. Walking on water? That's lagima, the ability to become weightless. Multiplying loaves and fishes? That's prakamya, the power to manifest matter. Healing the blind? That's simply the directed use of pranic energy through the hands. To a seasoned yogi, Jesus wasn't breaking the laws of nature. He was simply operating on a higher octave of them. If Jesus spent his silent years in the Himalayas or the forests of India, he wouldn't have just been reading scrolls, he would have been practicing asana, pranayama, and deep samadhi. The claim is that he became a mahasiddha, a great accomplished one. When he calmed the storm on the Sea of Galilee, he wasn't asking a distant deity to turn down the wind. He was using his own expanded consciousness to harmonize the external environment. In the Eastern view, the microcosm of the human body and the macrocosm of the universe are identical. A master who has conquered the inner weather can naturally influence the outer weather. It's not a parlor trick, it's a demonstration of the unity of all existence. Even the most famous miracle of all, raising the dead, finds its parallel in the yogic concept of kaya kalpa, or the ability to transfer life force. There are numerous accounts in Indian hagiography of Himalayan masters who could revive the recently deceased or even project their own consciousness into another body. When Jesus tells his disciples, "The things I do, you shall do also, and greater things," he is speaking like a guru who has mastered a science and is now inviting his students to learn the equations. He isn't claiming a monopoly on the supernatural. He is describing a latent human potential that remains dormant in the average person, but is fully awake in the yogi. This perspective recontextualizes the Son of God label. In the East, an avatar, or a jivanmukta, liberated soul, is someone who has cleared the casing of the ego so thoroughly that the divine light shines through without obstruction. The miracles were the proof of concept for his teaching that the physical world is Maya, a fluid, dreamlike construct that responds to the will of one who has truly woken up. By treating his miracles as siddhis, we move away from a magic man narrative and toward a master scientist of the soul. He wasn't trying to impress the crowds with a show. He was showing them that the material world is not the ultimate authority. Consciousness is. But if he had such mastery over the physical body, did he really die on that Roman cross? Or was it the ultimate yogic escape? The crucifixion survival. If we follow the yogic trail to its most controversial conclusion, we run headfirst into the swoon theory, the provocative idea that Jesus didn't actually die on the cross, but rather used his advanced mastery over his own physiology to enter a state of deep samadhi, or suspended animation. To a Roman centurion, a man with no detectable breath and a plummeting heart rate was simply a corpse ready for the tomb. To a Himalayan master, however, this state is a controlled metabolic shutdown known to those who have mastered the art of pranayama. Proponents of this theory, most notably the Ahmadiyya movement, and researchers like Holger Kirsten, argue that the resurrection wasn't a supernatural return from the afterlife, but a clinical recovery from a near-death state, aided by potent medicinal herbs like the massive quantities of aloe and myrrh mentioned in the Gospel of John, substances known more for their healing properties on flesh than for simple burial rituals. Why would he undertake such a radical deception? The narrative suggests that after surviving the brutal ordeal, Jesus realized his mission in Judea had reached its inevitable bloody terminus. If he stayed in Jerusalem, he faced immediate rearrest and a second execution. If he disappeared, he could return to the land that had nurtured his soul during his youth. This leads us to the explosive claim that Jesus traveled back to the east, seeking the lost sheep of the house of Israel, who had settled along the Silk Road and into the Indian subcontinent. In this version of history, the man who was crucified in his 30s didn't ascend into the literal clouds. He put on the saffron robes of a wanderer and walked toward the rising sun, eventually settling in the lush, temperate valley of Kashmir, a place often described as heaven on earth. The evidence cited for this second journey is often hidden in plain sight within regional folklore and ancient manuscripts that the West has long ignored. Throughout Persia and Afghanistan, legends persist of a great healer and prophet named Yuz Asaf, meaning leader of the healed or seeker, who arrived from the West with a message of peace and a body marked by the scars of a past trauma on the hands and feet. In the Bhavishya Purana, an ancient Sanskrit text, there is a recorded encounter between a king of Kashmir and a man named Isha Putra, son of God, who lived in the mountains and claimed to have been born of a virgin and persecuted by his people. The descriptions are far too specific to ignore as mere coincidence. They paint a portrait of a man who survived a political execution and spent his remaining years in a quiet, meditative exile, far from the reach of Rome. Furthermore, this samadhi theory offers a technical explanation for the shroud of mystery surrounding the empty tomb. If Jesus was a high-level yogi, he would have known how to slow his pulse to a level that would fool even a professional executioner. The 3 days in the tomb weren't a stay in the land of the dead, but a period of intensive recovery and deep meditation. This shifts the entire paradigm of the ascension. Instead of a vertical exit from the planet into a different dimension, it becomes a horizontal migration across the map. It portrays a Jesus who lived to a ripe old age, perhaps even marrying and having a family, finally free from the political tinderbox of Roman-occupied Jerusalem. This isn't just a minor biographical tweak. It's a fundamental reimagining of the Christ figure from a sacrificial lamb into a long-lived sage. He didn't come to die for sins. He came to live as a radical example of what a human being becomes when they have mastered the biological machine. The cross wasn't the end of the story. It was the dramatic stage exit that allowed the master to return to the silence of the mountains, where the king of the Jews could finally live as a king of yogis. If he truly spent his final decades in the East, does his physical body still lie hidden in a quiet corner of Kashmir? The Rosabal Shrine. In the winding alleys of Srinagar, Kashmir, lies the Rosabal, a modest shrine that serves as the controversial epicenter of the Jesus in India theory. While officially regarded as the tomb of Uz Asaf, a local Muslim saint, many researchers believe it houses the physical remains of Jesus of Nazareth. The site offers tantalizing forensic clues that deviate sharply from local Islamic customs. Most notably, the sarcophagus is oriented east to west, aligning with ancient Jewish burial traditions rather than the north to south orientation typical of Islam. The most provocative evidence is a stone slab bearing carved footprints. These carvings clearly depict scars on the tops of the feet, mirroring the specific wounds inflicted by Roman crucifixion. For theorists like Andreas Faber-Kaiser, these marks suggest the occupant was a traveler from the West who had survived a horrific execution attempt. Local oral traditions further bridge this gap, as hereditary caretakers claim to be descendants of a prophet from the Holy Land, who arrived in Kashmir to preach parables and oneness, concepts that harmonize Christ's teachings with Indian Vedic philosophy. Throughout the 19th century, locals openly referred to the site as the Tomb of Isha, Jesus, suggesting a long-standing historical memory of his presence. Today, the Rosabal remains a spiritual and political landmine. Despite calls for DNA testing to settle the identity of the remains, access is strictly controlled by authorities wary of religious unrest. Whether the tomb contains a historical reality or a powerful legend, it transforms the narrative of the crucifixion from a tragic end into a quiet epilogue of Himalayan exile. It posits that the light of the world didn't extinguish in Judea, but simply relocated to the peace of the mountains. While the Yogi Jesus narrative is undeniably cinematic, mainstream historians and theologians aren't exactly lining up to buy a ticket. The consensus view treats these theories as a mix of pious fraud and creative historical fiction. Skeptics point out that the Himis scrolls Nicholas Notovich claimed to find have never been seen by any independent scholar, leading many to believe the Russian journalist simply invented the life of Saint Isha to capitalize on the 19th century obsession with Eastern mysticism. Furthermore, linguists argue that the Isha-Yeshua connection is more of a phonetic coincidence than a cultural link, noting that ancient names often sound similar across unrelated languages. Critics also highlight that the Rosabal Shrine is likely the tomb of a medieval Muslim saint, and the crucifixion scars on the stone footprints are common symbolic motifs in regional art. To the academic world, the theory is a classic example of projection, an attempt to make a universal figure more relatable to a globalized world. Without concrete, peer-reviewed archaeological evidence, the Eastern Christ remains a fascinating what if rather than a historical is. If this deep dive blew your mind, subscribe for more historical mysteries.